Thank you, Ricardo, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It is really good to be with you, and I'm so proud to sit at this virtual table with Dr. Banks, Professor Hamilton, and Ms. Glover Blackwell today to affirm our commitment to building a nation where every person can work, live, and thrive with dignity. To declare that all people should have a right to employment that ensures a dignified standard of living. Our call to action is a historic one. It's one that builds on the legacy of those who have fought for economic justice and liberation for generations. Tomorrow, I will formally introduce a congressional resolution calling for a federal job guarantee, which would provide every person in America with an enforceable legal right to a quality job. Extending beyond a project-based approach, our resolution calls for the creation of federal jobs that meet long-neglected community, physical, and human infrastructure needs, such as delivering high-quality care for children and seniors, building and sustaining 21st century transit systems, strengthening our neighborhoods, and protecting the environment. A federal job guarantee would provide public jobs for all adults seeking employment and would be funded by the federal government and implemented locally in close partnership with communities and reflective and responsive to community needs. So by ensuring everyone has access to a good job with dignified wages, safe working conditions, healthcare, and other benefits, including full worker rights and union protections. A federal job guarantee would address the current unemployment crisis, make our economy more resilient, begin closing the racial and gender income gaps, and lay the foundation for a truly just and equitable economic recovery. This is a bold idea. It's responsive to the needs of communities across the country. And the resolution speaks to a promise unfulfilled and a solution that meets the moment. In this time of uncertainty, the people who call America home deserve meaningful, dignified work and a livable wage. The idea that all people should have a right to employment that ensures a dignified standard of living has deep roots in American history, and it was a key demand of the civil rights movement. In President Franklin Roosevelt's proposed Economic Bill of Rights, the right to a useful and remunerative job was front and center. Nearly a century ago, Sadie Alexander, the nation's first Black economist, advocated a job guarantee to address racial discrimination against Black workers while improving labor market conditions for all workers. The 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech, was a march for jobs and freedom. When hundreds of thousands gathered in Washington to demand voting rights and economic justice in the form of a massive federal program to train and place unemployed workers in meaningful, dignified jobs for decent wages. Coretta Scott King would later lead a grassroots movement in support of a federal job guarantee. And in recent years, there have been calls for a public option for employment, but the deep disparities exposed by the health and economic crisis we now face really does require and demand that we go even further. The time to establish a legal right to a job for all people in America is now. So today, we're proud to build upon and honor the legacy and work of generations of Black women civil rights leaders to introduce a historic resolution affirming just that. The civil rights leader Ella Baker once said, "People cannot be free until there is enough work in this land to give everybody a job." A job guarantee is an investment in the American people, our communities, and an equitable economy that works for everyone. Our ongoing struggle for civil rights demands our collective action to uplift the dignity, humanity, and freedom of every member of our society, and that begins with a federal job guarantee. So with that, I will pass over this virtual mic to Dr. Nina Banks, President of the National Economic Association.
Thank you, Congresswoman Pressley. In 1945, a year after President Roosevelt called for a second Bill of Rights, Sadie Tanner Marcel Alexander, the nation's first Black economist, advocated for full employment and a federal job guarantee. Dr. Alexander believed that unemployment was the central economic problem that our nation faced. She was also aware that persistent racial discrimination against Black workers relegated them to the status of marginal workers who suffered from chronically high rates of unemployment since they were the last hired and the first to be fired. Given this, Dr. Alexander knew that Black workers would especially benefit from full employment policies. She said that full employment was the only solution to the economic subjugation of Black workers, as well as the great masses of other workers. Sadie Alexander believed that all workers would benefit from full employment because it would provide job security. The threat of unemployment erodes workers' ability to negotiate with employers over better compensation and working conditions. Dr. Alexander believed that having a fully employed labor force would increase workers' pay and purchasing power. Therefore, she believed that the federal government should provide jobs that paid livable wages to all workers who were willing and able to work, but who were unable to do so because of the failure of the private sector to create enough jobs. Dr. Alexander maintained that the right to work was a fundamental right of citizenship. The example of the success of direct job creation during World War II was the lesson that President Roosevelt and Sadie Alexander drew upon when they called for a fully employed labor force in the post-war period. 3/4 of a century ago, Sadie Alexander promoted full employment as the solution to the overall problem of economic precarity and as the means for countering persistent racial discrimination in employment. She envisioned that full employment policies would ameliorate many of the economic problems that continue to plague workers in the US: income inequality, involuntary unemployment, marginal work, inadequate wages, and racial disparities in access to good jobs. A federal job guarantee provides racial and economic justice while also recognizing the corrosive nature of economic deprivation in our communities and the benefits instead of shared prosperity that expands citizens' rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. That's such important historical contextualizing. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Derek Hamilton. I'm sorry, actually, no. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Angela Glover Blackwell, founder of PolicyLink.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman Pressley, for your leadership on this. Historically, this has been in the making for a long time, and never have we needed it more than we need it right now. The very idea that we could have a federal job guarantee that could be responsive to the angst that so many people have been feeling as we wonder, how are we going to recover from this economic crisis in a way that is fully inclusive and equitable? The way to do that is to guarantee everybody a job. We know that people are going to be slow to come back. And those who will be slowest to come back are those who need it most, those who are always targeted and discriminated against. We also know that during this time when so many jobs have been lost, the community needs have been great. The very idea that the federal job guarantee would be a way for communities to be able to have people do the work of rebuilding community, of investing in infrastructure, the human infrastructure for the care economy, as well as the infrastructure in transportation and other things that are so vital. We also know that people want to work, and too often people have to work without dignity, without the pay that really provides that dignity. To be able to create that floor so that the floor is work with dignity, it will do something about the 40% of workers who earn less than $15 an hour. It'll also put pressure on private employers to be able to make sure that they are providing work with dignity and the dignity of pay. This is a moment in which we really can respond to the demand that we finally step into building an equitable economy. Everybody who wants to be able to work should be able to work. And what that will mean for parents, what that will mean for families, what that will mean for community, and what it'll mean for the earth and climate is just so essential. This is a big step forward, long time in the making, and I'm just so pleased to see this important step moving the way that we make sure that we live up to the promise that we make to people, that if they step forward to work, there are jobs with dignity that are there waiting for them, and many of them will help to build community and strengthen community. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for speaking to the transformative impact that a federal job guarantee would have and why it's not just about jobs. Grateful for your leadership and your partnership on this. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Derek Hamilton, Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and Director of the Institute on Race and Political Economy at the New School.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's an honor to be here and share the stage with my great colleagues and you, and appreciate all your leadership. So let me get right into it. By April of last year, our unemployment rate reached about 14.7% or even higher. And that's the highest it's ever been since the Great Depression. The unemployment rate for Black workers in April was about 17% and about 14% for white workers. Usually the unemployment rate is far more dramatic, but we made a conscious decision to hibernate our economy to save lives. But as we've begun to relax some of our social distance rules, we've seen the reemergence of the adage that Black people in an economic business cycle are the first fired and last hired. Currently, the unemployment rate stands at 6.3% for everyone, 9.2% for Black workers, and 5.7% for white workers. But the unemployment statistics that I've reported underestimate the economic toll of this pandemic. Underemployment, being out of the labor force, loss of health insurance, the mental and financial angst of unemployment associated with this pandemic or any other time takes a great toll on our society. The only way that an increase will not happen in terms of inequality as we get past this pandemic is if we have a change in our political economy towards a new structural policy that recognizes that changes on the margin won't cut it. To reverse decades and generations of poverty, discrimination, and economic and political concentration at the top, we're going to need a bold overhaul of our laws and our economy, and that needs to be anchored by the automatic stabilizer of a federal job guarantee. Stimulus plans championed on both sides of the aisle, they use tax incentives and deregulation to cajole or bribe a private sector to provide more jobs under the lure that this is going to create a dynastism, and it also with the goal of trying to rebuild the nation's crumbling infrastructure. The problem with this approach is that it leaves workers vulnerable to the whimsical nature of trickle-down employment and the instability of contingent work. Moreover, it's often a transfer of the value of our public physical and human infrastructure assets to corporate interests with no guarantee that the infrastructure will actually be built and shared in the first place. Instead, what the Congresswoman is calling for is a federal job guarantee to provide a direct source of employment, to trigger a multiplier stimulus effect across our economy and enable all workers, particularly those at the low end of the labor market, to bargain for better wages and benefits without the fear and destitution from the threat of unemployment. It would strategically change the US economy away from low-wage work towards more moderate and high-wage jobs and buffer against employment transitions due to automation or any type of technological change. Not only would this job guarantee restore psychological balance to the millions of unemployed individuals who desire work but cannot, it would address the long-standing unjust and discriminatory barriers that keep large segments of stigmatized populations out of the labor force. And it would reverse the rising tide of inequality for all workers by strengthening their labor market bargaining power and ensuring that the US lives up to its unfunded mandate as described earlier and actually achieve an authentic full employment and eliminate involuntary unemployment altogether. So reject the empirically unsubstantiated and even racist rhetoric that ignorance, so-called grit, and personal responsibility are the sources of inequality. Along with this neoliberal paternalism in which government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. Instead, change the paradigm, be bold, work at the federal level, even local levels, and let's guarantee a right to quality employment and empower people with economic security, dignity, and authentic agency to define and achieve their goals.
Thank you, Professor Hamilton. As always, you provide us with both an education, truth-telling, and a call to action. So appreciate your thought leadership in this endeavor. And now we'll turn it back over to Ricardo.
Thanks, Congresswoman. Thanks, everyone. We will now move to questions from the media on the line. Just to reiterate, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom, and I'll call on you. The raise hand function, you can find that under reactions at the panel at the bottom of the screen. I'll give folks a moment. All right. First up, we'll hear from Ilan Mui at CNBC.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. My question is, how do you see some of these jobs interacting with private sector jobs that might be existing in the space already? Do you see this as being a replacement for some of the private sector work, or do you see this as additive to places where the private sector may be not willing or not able to go?
I'll take that, Ilan. This is Representative Pressley. First, let me just sort of begin with a broader framework here. I know it is customary for folks to often only revisit the words of Dr. King and even to be selective in that in the observance of his birthday or during Black History Month. But I sit with his words and his texts often. And, you know, one of the things that he said that deeply resonates with me and I think is very applicable to this moment is that it was easier to integrate public facilities. It was easier to gain the right to vote because it didn't cost the nation anything. The fact is that we're clearly dealing with issues now that will call for the fundamental restructuring of American society. It is going to cost the nation something. And so, you know, as we find ourselves dealing with the gravity and the weight of these three conflated crises, and we're looking for how to have a just and equitable economic recovery, but also to chart a different path forward. The word reckoning keeps being thrown around. Well, a reckoning is something of, you know, epic proportion. And so I think given the scale and scope of the three conflated crises, bearing down and expressed commitments to address everything from climate change to economic hardship to systemic and structural racism, a federal job guarantee allows us to accomplish all of those things. And so I really do see it as enhancement. And it does get us to that more than a return to a pre-COVID insufficient, unjust status quo normal, but is charting a better path forward. So it allows us to mitigate you know, existing hurt, have that robust recovery, and to chart a better path forward. So I really do see it as enhancement. And it's just really important that we have bold policy proposals that truly meet the scale and scope of the crisis.
I so appreciate that put in the context of a racial reckoning, because it certainly would do that in terms of making up for so many times when people who are Black and Latinx and Indigenous have been excluded from job opportunities in the economy. But it wouldn't replace private jobs, but it would put pressure on private employers, because by providing dignified wages, dignified livable wages, and having those jobs available to anybody who wants one, it would make it hard for the private sector to pay very low wages and not treat people with dignity. And so to the degree that there's any pressure on the private sector, it's pressure to be able to lean in, join the future, and treat employers with the respect that they are due, not just take advantage of people being desperate for work and taking any kind of job to be able to have a job.
Yeah, both of those answers I'm going to add to and say that they're spot on, and just say it also will complement good jobs and employers that desire additional infrastructure, both physical and human infrastructure. and we have historical precedent. The New Deal benefited the private sector by enhancing both our physical and human infrastructure. Imagine an industrial policy where workers are able to show up with better wages, better health care, and also some care associated with the federal jobs in the first place. If we're investing in a care economy, that's not only going to benefit people, it's going to benefit the private sector because their workforce will be better.
And this is Nina Banks, and I'm just going to add from the context of Sadie Alexander, she absolutely envisioned that there would be additional jobs, and they would be jobs that would address urgent national problems. And as Derek said, not just physical infrastructure, but also human infrastructure. And so she believed that we needed to invest in jobs to address issues tied to housing, people who were living in slums, literacy, and also providing access to utilities for everybody within the country. So this is absolutely an expansion of work opportunities. It's not going to displace the private sector.
Great, thank you.
Great. And next we have Joseph at Business Insider.
Hi, Representative Pressley. Thanks so much for organizing this call. So my question is, I was wondering if there were any cost estimates as to this federal job guarantee, and if so, what are they? And whether you or your office has been communicating with the Biden administration on this, given their interest in a large infrastructure package in the immediate future.
Considering the fact that that Congress just passed last year, a $750 billion funding bill, which bankrolled the Pentagon and defense contractors, all while arguing that direct payments to put survival checks, direct relief into the people's pockets was too expensive, albeit in the midst of a public health pandemic. It's ironic that every time we're pushing for bold policies that really do center people, those most impacted and meets their needs, that the question is, how will we pay for it? Or sort of how can we best target relief? So, like anything, and I'll just say this, Joseph, prior to my election to Congress, I served on the Boston City Council for 8 years. And we would often say that a budget is a reflection of our values. However, I was often having these unjust binary, really false binary choices that were being foisted, onto me in that decision-making process. And that hasn't changed since I've arrived at Congress. So I think like anything that is a priority, we appropriate the funds. But the reality is we are already paying by not having this policy. What's the cost of having millions unemployed? Massachusetts, last summer, our unemployment rate had climbed to 17.4%, the worst in the nation. And while that number has improved today, there's still hundreds of thousands that remain out of work. The Massachusetts 7th is this vibrant, diverse, dynamic district, and one of the most unequal in the country. And so I see up close and personal every day in community, the lived reality, the hardship of these economic inequities and disparities. It's not abstract. It's all around me. And so we have to act. We're already paying. Tens of millions paid an unlivable wage. Hundreds of thousands being unhoused or facing homelessness. So the only thing we can't afford right now is to preserve the status quo. And we really can't buy into these false scarcity narratives because the money is there. We just won't allow these policy decisions to be made at the expense of our communities any longer.
I love the phrase that Representative Pressley used, better path forward, because that's what this federal job guarantee does. in that it provides automatic stabilizers, and it expands when we need it most and it contracts when we need it not as most. And it also directs resources to the regions and areas that are needed most. So we have not only over time and business cycles will we need to ramp up public spending when we get into recessionary times, but we have regions of the country that are very underdeveloped, and they need stimulus. They need economic activity. And what this federal job guarantee will do is bring some needed resources to those areas in an automatic stabilizing way. And we have done cost estimates on this bill, but it's also nice to put those costs into a context of, we just passed over close to $3 trillion this past summer. And prior to that, we passed the Trump tax cut, which is going to cost us more than $2.1 trillion. So I love the phrasing of, what are our values? We certainly have demonstrated the capacity to fund big, bold initiatives. The question is, are we funding them in a way that's consistent with our shared prosperity, or in a way that's going to trickle up to those that already have economic and political influence?
And then I did, Joseph, I'm sorry, I was remiss in just answering the second part of your question, which is yes. I've been in ongoing communication with the Biden administration about everything from cabinet to sub-cabinet appointees to policy priorities like this one, and the need for us to go big, to advance bold policies that will meet the scale and scope of the crisis. And that I do see things like my baby bonds bill with Senator Booker, and like my federal job guarantee as a part of a necessary approach to a long-term and just economic recovery. And so I plan to work with them to ensure that this is a part of those efforts.
And actually, a quick follow-up: is there a Senate companion, or is there a senator you're working with on this in the Senate?
I'm in preliminary conversations, so that's the short answer, but that's embargoed for now. So we'll keep you posted, but yes, I'm in encouraging conversations.
Thank you so much.
Great. And now we'll hear from Anna at the Sadie Collective.
Hi, thank you so much for allowing me to be on this call and just to hear from the Black excellence we're seeing across the economic space. So I'm currently co-writing a piece for the Times that is concerning Black Women Best, which is a policy idea that says, if we center Black women in economic policies, then everyone else will be uplifted. And so my question for you all is, with the federal jobs guarantee, it sounds like a really excellent bill in terms of addressing racial justice, especially at the intersection of economic policy. But how will this actually impact Black women specifically, who we know bear the brunt of economic crises, as well as improve the access to jobs that Black women may or may not be having access to right now? Thank you so much.
Would Dr. Banks or Ms. Glover Blackwell want to start that one off?
Thank you. I'd love to answer that question. Such a good question. And there's no doubt that this is the kind of initiative that actually starts by asking, what do those who are most targeted, most isolated, most discriminated against, most vulnerable within our economy need in order to be able to fully participate? And we know that Black women are disproportionately concentrated in low-wage work. And we know that too often it is work without dignity. And we need to guarantee that Black women have access to work, access to the kind of work they're doing anyway, often for no pay, in their community, taking care of the elders, taking care of the children, taking care of the community. And this actually would provide for that to be paid work with health benefits, paid work with decent wages. And we know that that is the way to be able to solve problems fundamentally in a big way. I call it the curb cut effect, like those curb cuts in the sidewalk that are there for people in wheelchairs with disabilities from their advocacy, but they benefit us all. It's an example of when you solve problems for those who are most marginalized with nuance and specificity, you solve them for everybody. Presley. The federal job guarantee is that. It starts with those who have the toughest time getting in, who are most discriminated against, who are the first fired and the last hired. And often the jobs are not jobs that people can actually support their families. Start there. Start with Black women. Solve it for them with nuance, and it will benefit everybody. This is a perfect example of that.
And I'll just build on that, and I just say that just building on that point there, I do want to highlight again that the resolution does call for the creation of federal jobs that meet these long neglected community, physical, and human infrastructure needs, like delivering high quality childcare for children and seniors. To the doctor's point, these are things that have often been poorly or not compensated, building and sustaining 21st century transit systems, strengthening our neighborhoods, protecting the environment. We know that economic exploitation, there are many casualties of that, Black women being chief amongst them, dominating essential workforces, low wage workforces. We know that pre-COVID, there were something like 3.7 million eviction filings, and the lion's share of those were represented by Black women. As we see so many families on the precipice of eviction right now, that continues to track and to trend in that way. So that's why we need to ensure that our recovery is one that does not recover us back to a pre-COVID status quo, inadequate normal, but that again, we are charting a different path forward, and that this recovery leaves no one behind, including our most marginalized. As for your Black Woman Best campaign, I want to thank you for creating it. And I want to say that as important as it is that we have policies that center the needs of Black women, it's critical that we have Black women in positions to write those policies. So I do just want to acknowledge the labor of love and the intellectual capital and sweat equity of my senior aide in this space, our sort of in-house economist, Aya Ibrahim. And so when we say that personnel is policy, that's real.
I have a really quick follow-up question and just a very short clarification. So Black Women Best, by the way, is coined currently by Janelle Jones, who is the chief economist, the Department of Labor currently. My only follow-up question is that, to your point, Congresswoman, are you saying that essentially this resolution would also be beneficial, not just for creating jobs, but ensuring that those jobs actually come back to sort of big picture issues around the environment, like climate change?
Absolutely. And that's why I see it as timely, because we do have these conflated sort of intersectional crises. And so at a moment of reckoning where there is an express commitment to address everything from the economic hardship and impact of the coronavirus to addressing the pandemic, to addressing climate, to addressing systemic and structural racism, this does allow us to get at all of those things.
Thank you so much.
Oh, and I do think it just again, and just one more thing, and I do appreciate your Black labor is often it's not credited. So I appreciate your correcting me on the record there about Janelle. But I did also think it was important just to reiterate that a federal job guarantee will ensure that everyone has access to a good job with dignified wages and safe working conditions, healthcare, and other benefits, including full worker rights and union protections. And so that's exactly how we address the current unemployment crisis and then make our economy more resilient, close racial and gender income gaps, and again, lay that foundation for a just and equitable economic recovery.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right, and next we'll hear from Jarrell at Bloomberg.
Hi, first off, I wanted to thank you for holding this and thank you for inviting me. I just wanted to ask Congresswoman Pressley if you have spoken to House leadership Nancy Pelosi or any other members of House leadership about this resolution, and have they signaled any support for it?
I've not as of yet, but I will.
Thank you.